tekrar huzurunuzda teşekkür etmek istiyorum. Kendilerini kısaca tanıtayım. Arnaud Kopp 2019'dan beri Zürih'in Türkiye Property ve Casualty, yani mülk ve kaza branşına sorumlu olarak görev almakta. 2015 yılında Zürih merkezi reisans şirketine katılmış. Troitzsch sigortacılık konusunda uzman. Akdeniz bölgesi özelinde müşteri yönetimi, inovasyon alanlarında çeşitli pozisyonlarda bulunmuş bugüne kadar. Arnaud InsurTech sektöründe öğretim üyeliği yapıyor. Birçok yerde lecture veriyor. Mentor ve yönetim kurulu üyesi olarak da aktif görev almakta. Hukuk alanında kendisinin lisans derecesi var. Sigorta, yönetim ve hukuk alanlarında da yüksek lisans derecesine sahip. Raphael 2019'dan beri Boston Consultancy Group'ta Zürih ofisinde ortak olarak çalışmakta. Özellikle sigorta alanında özelleşmiş bir eksper. Sigorta alanında her ürün grubunda özellikle reisans, strateji, operasyon, IT ve modelleme çalışmaları üzerine yoğunlaşmış. BCG öncesinde de Sivris'de direktörlük yaptığı ifade etmek istiyorum. Ben şimdi sözü öncelikle Arnaud'a vermek istiyorum. Sunumunu gerçekleştirmek için. Arnaud, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Özgür Bey. And merhaba everyone. Real pleasure to be here today. So, and I would like to thank the association and as well the BCG for.
Ve BCG'ye ve CSB'ye de teşekkür etmek istiyorum. Bugünkü
for the company Swiss and I'm responsible for the Turkish market in non-life, and I've worked on Turkey since 2018. So today, the aim of the session on my hand would be to share some observations after the earthquake of February, and as well some perspectives about what kind of observations we can have, potential lesson learned already, and as well some thoughts, especially because as I can imagine, having today a reinsurers, it's as well interesting to have our perspective with what will be the impact for the renewal in January in 2024. So I think the first thing which is interesting, if I'm just exactly, is to put back this event a little bit into a context, because I think when the event happened, the industry, whether it's insurance industry and as well especially the reinsurance industry in a worldwide level, did not capture the gravity of the event. Of course, in terms of the human tragedy that this one represented, but as well from a scientific perspective, what this event meant. And the first thing is, if we look at a little bit this event, it's just a geographical scale that people struggle to capture if you're not from Turkey. We just, for the sake of the exercise, took a comparison Google map with some geocode and put the affected area into a context that we are more familiar in Switzerland. And the size of the event in terms of the geographic is as big as Switzerland. So that puts things into context in terms of how large this event was in terms of geographic. The second thing is, of course, you're well aware that we had two large earthquakes within the same 24 hours. So we have a 7.5 and a 7.8. To put things into perspective, so in Swiss Re, we have the database of the last 100 years of this earthquake activity in Turkey. So if we look at the statistics from 1920 to 2020, we have 21 earthquakes in Turkey which have a magnitude above 7, so from 7 and above. If we take 7.5 as a trigger, we reduce the amount of earthquake to 5 from 1920 to 2020, affecting the Turkey. So here we're talking about two earthquakes, 7.8, 7.5, 7.4, depending on the agencies. out of a period of 100 years where we recorded only 21 above 7. And if I link it as well to the point number 4, one of the elements in terms of how destructive and fatal an earthquake can be is the depth, or how shallow or how deep an earthquake is. And the more shallow it is, the more the impact, bigger the impact can be. If we look at, again, this 21 earthquake, we had only 10 over a period of 100 years which had a depth between 10 to 20 kilometers. The rest of these earthquakes were above 20 kilometers. Both of the earthquakes here had depth below 10 kilometers or close to 10 kilometers. So we are talking again about a characteristic which is just making the event worse in terms of the impact that it has. And then maybe some of you are familiar with the Swiss tool CatNet that many are using in the market. And it's just showing the level of acceleration which was recorded. So it's basically you record the ground, the moving ground with what they call PSA with the acceleration. And you can see that's the 7.8 earthquake. How many areas have reached the maximum, which is in dark red here, the maximum ground shaking registered. So just to show how extreme this event was, I think we have some recording showing how severe the acceleration recorded was in some areas. And the last part is, of course, it was not only 2 earthquakes within the same 24 hours, it was dozens of earthquakes which were recorded, which of course are making the consequence of the event worse. So I think it's just important to put this event into an historical characteristics in Turkey, and this event has definitely characteristics making it one of the worst in the modern history of Turkey, where we have recorded data, just to put things into perspective. So when we went to Istanbul, I think that was two days after the earthquake. 2 weeks, sorry, after the earthquake. I'm just trying to move the slide. Exactly. Thank you. 2 weeks after the earthquake, we had a couple of observations. The first one, and I think, was that for most insurance companies, but as well, for most modeling companies, you had a big difference between, what the model were giving you versus what the actual loss were looking like. And I think this event is just a reminder about a model. It's just a model per se. So it's not the truth. By nature is wrong. And it's a piece of information which helps us to take decisions around the level of protection that we need to take. But what is clear is among the modelers, but Swiss Re as well, having its own proprietary model, it was really difficult to find in the list of events that we were that you stochastically created. So it's a fake event that you create just to run it to see what the impact could it have on your portfolio. Really few agencies had an event really similar to that, especially the 2 earthquakes within the same 24 hours, and the impact that this one could have one on each other. So that was the first observations that we had. And I think it's great that the regulators, the association, the industry has been extremely proactive to discuss in the market about, what can we learn in terms of modeling, but as well how we can adjust potentially our NatCat purchase requirement in the market to make sure that all our companies are well protected for the risk of earthquake, and of course for the Istanbul scenario that everyone is aware of. The second piece is, of course, lines of business impacted. So fire, property is always the main line of business impacted, and this event was not an exception. We had some large industrial loss recorded in the market that we are all aware of, whether it's some factories at the port as well. So that is nothing surprising. Engineering has been not too impacted, and I think it's a question a bit of a luck that you have, whether you have projects in the areas which are affected, and that was not so much the case. One surprise was potentially motor-owned damage, and due to the characteristic I was mentioning, and especially the scale from a geographical perspective. So what you have is you have probably an MOD loss contribution to the total loss, which will be probably a bit higher than what people would have anticipated. It's not a game changer, but that's an element which is probably above what people would have planned. And of course, what we will observe is a protection gap. So it's a difference between the insurance loss level, so what the industry will pay versus what the economical loss will be registered. So here again, I think there seems to be a consensus, and Swiss Re as well has the view that the insurance market loss is around the 5 billion. I saw Munich Re as well today in their Q1 results, figures quite similar. The economical loss is more difficult, of course, and I don't think that there is a consensus, because you need to take into consideration the reconstruction cost, plus then the economical one. So I think we have figures floating, between 30. We had World Bank around 30 to 100. So it's I would say it's still early. So I don't think we can have a consensus around one figure, but it's clear that there will be a difference. And to put things into perspective, that's not new. So in 2022, the protection gap worldwide was 55%. So the insurance industry.
Uçurumu %22'di ve bu sadece %45 ödeme indi. Normalde hani 10 yıllık ortalamaya bakarsak %59 zaten ödeme oranı. Yani bu noktada bu çok, yani bunu nasıl düzelteceğimize sektör olarak birlikte bakmamız gerekiyor. Bu tabii ki onların dışında ayrıca gözlemlemekten büyük keyif aldığımız bir başka şey de sektörün ne kadar dayanıklı olduğuydu ve şirketlerin bu proaktif kriz yönetimi konusunda olabilmesi ve bilgi akımını sağlaması ve altyapıyı çok hızlı bir şekilde oluşturup bilgi toplama konusunda çok aktif olması, bu anlamda teknoloji.
A source of information to provide a first flow of data about which the level of damage. After a month and a half or 2 months, a lot of insurers have already visited all the risk affected on the commercial side. And the industry, I think, and with the help of the public sector, really organized itself in terms of technology. So you had, of course, the TCIP loss adjusters and the database. Things were leveraged where companies could actually tap into data set without having the notification of the insured. The government as well opened satellite data, where we have seen work from Microsoft running some artificial intelligence program to do self-detection of partial to total loss. So I think there is a lot of in this strategy. I really got a lot of positive about how the sector has been resilient, not only in terms of how the fact that the sector is paying and paying fast, but as well how the sector reacted and how quickly it reacted to help the people. So I think it's for us at least, we see it definitely as something extremely positive and something that we want to share, after this event to our clients outside Turkey about this case study, because we really think there are some really positive here to take from this event about how the industry managed it. If we look at now going forward in terms of the post-event perspective, I think the first one is around, and we see it in worldwide after natural catastrophe, and is the post-loss amplification. So in Turkey is a country which is used to inflation. I think it's a country which has, I would say, a certain expertise and in the insurance industry to manage it. It's well known that with European companies having insurance companies to deal with inflation this year, many Turkish entity of European companies were basically teaching to the European peers how to deal with the inflation from a business model and system perspective. So Turkey is I would say, really well equipped as an industry to manage the inflation topic up to a certain extent. But here the question is how much the earthquake will create an additional buffer of inflation and on the loss. So that's always something that that has its challenge in terms of quantification and estimation. The second one, and I think it's probably for us maybe the main learning from this event is the topic of accumulation. If you were talking earthquake Turkey, everyone was talking about Istanbul, and rightly so, regarding the sum insured and as well the history. But I think we might have forgot the accumulation, the potential exposure in other areas of the country where you have a seismic plague. And this event is a reminder of that. And I think one of the learning is probably, okay, how going forward we can manage this accumulation across the countries and in a more proactive way, and make sure that we have the natural catastrophe, the NatCat protection adjusted to this accumulation, and not only Istanbul, because I think some companies got the surprise that they had a loss or had a concentration in that region which was higher than the average market share, which is not something bad per se. I think what is potentially problematic is if you don't have it on the radar. And the question is, even as a reinsurer, because you have such a focus on Istanbul scenario, that you might forget as well the rest, which have a real exposure. And then it's linked as well to transposing this into the cat protections. And I said, I think it's great the industry is having these discussions about the level of protections required for insurance companies. And I think we are going to, from a modeling perspective, get a lot of learnings from this event. And I think it's great as well that you have one of the national reinsurers who is as well developing its own model, so you create another view, because I think the more view you have, the better it is, because as mentioned, by nature a model is wrong. It's just it's an opinion, and that gives an information which help you to make calculated decisions about the level of protections that you need. And I think the more external views you have, the better it is in terms of decision making. So I think from the strategy, we will see definitely some positive here, I think, in terms of earthquake modeling in Turkey. The fourth one, I think, is the questions of mechanism in terms of, okay, the level of equity for insurance companies, and what we will see is, so we have the post-loss amplifications. We have the fact that because of this event, potential insurance company will have to buy more natural catastrophe cover. You have potentially original insured would like to buy more beside the inflation, because they realize that just beside the inflation, they want to have more. And you have the fact that some people who were not buying insurance might want to buy insurance now. So you have this accumulated factor with the fact that the market will have to find an equilibrium at renewal about the level of retentions between insurance companies and reinsurers for the earthquake capacity and the earthquake exposure. there will be questions about, okay, what amount of equity is linked to this exposure, and how much equity is required to have this exposure. So we think it's an element to take into considerations, because we see several independent factors that can push the earthquake exposure. We have a certain dynamic in the reinsurance international market, which is pushing retention up. And so it's a question of, okay, how the equity is playing into that. And the last one is the protection gap as an industry, as I said, to reduce it. And I think reducing it is three elements. The first thing is trying to increase the insurance penetration, so people buying insurance. And I think we saw it, for example, with TCIP, we did insurance penetrations, and I think the government has been extremely active in the past years, you know, and to set up TCIP as a fund to increase the penetration. And it's not something which is easy. Many countries are struggling to increase insurance penetration. As I said, worldwide protection gap, it's 55% 2020. So it's a macro problem. But you have as well two other elements, is the fact that people are having the right limits to their risks. And as well, the third one is the fact that they understand the product that they are buying. And it's always a self, not always say criticism, but self-reflection we need to make ourselves as an industry, is about how we can make sure that the insured have a proper understanding of what is covered, what is not covered, and that maybe things which are probably the easiest thing to implement, because it's not linked to buying behaviors of the insured, but more about how do we present information as an industry to the insured in terms of what is covered and what is not covered. So at least when an event is happening, the insured is aware that or the insured doesn't have a surprise that something is covered or something is not covered. So that's, I think, the overall perspective that I wanted to give, which was really specific to Turkey. But I think now it's going to be nicely complemented by Raph, who will give a little bit more of a macro perspective on the topic. Raphael, over to you, and thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Arnaud, and thanks for the handover. Good morning, everyone. I'm Raph Troitzsch. I'm a partner in the Zürich office with BCG, and earlier this year we published a paper on the back of really quite an active NatCat season last year, and then unfortunately also including the beginning of this year in Turkey, which we call the Insurance Innovation in the Eye of the Storm. And so what I'd love to do is, rather than look at this title page, actually go to this next page, where we say, if we zoom out, obviously these kind of cat events, they happen all around the world. And right in the center of the page, we've got with surprising equal spacing in time, so every 12 years approximately, there seems to be a massive earthquake in Turkey. And Arnaud, you told us earlier that, of course, there were far more than that if we look back the last 100 years. What we find is that those events usually act as a trigger also for innovation. And now I'm trying to move the page along, and then we jumped too many because I was too impatient. There we go. They've always been a trigger for significant innovation. So if you look at this timeline, and to some of you, this may be a familiar view at the sort of weather-related insurance losses in the last 35 years-ish. This takes a little bit of a US-centric view, but it is helpful to take that as an example to take a look at what has actually changed. If we go all the way back to Hurricane Andrew, which, if you look at more recent loss history, isn't such a big event, but back in the 90s it certainly was, and it led directly to how building codes were carried out in the US. The Florida Hurricane Fund was formed back then, which of course was in the press again towards the end of last year. And then as we go to 2005, and I was actually in the US when Katrina hit, and certainly it was all over the news, and it increased a lot of awareness of the risks associated with property locations. And it led to, in the insurance industry, it led to a tightening of policy wordings, and also the emergence of reinsurance sidecars came about. And then if we look at 2018 as another example, the California wildfires led to, again, to quite a few innovations in the product sense, so creation of MGAs, but also in terms of certain new legislation that comes in to boost the resilience against events like wildfires. And we see that, you know, if you just take a step away from the actual insurance industry, we see that there were quite a few learnings to be had, like clearing areas of forest or trees around houses to make to create a barrier for fires, for example. Creating barriers, if we look at the bottom of the page, is also something that people always try and often fail to do when it's about flooding. And we'll talk about flood re in a few slides time again. But also on that front, there is often an element of state and industry joint reaction to these kind of events. Now, if we look at these losses, then you would sort of hope that there is also the capital behind it. And for sure, in the last 20 years, that's been the case, apart from last year, where through a sort of a culmination of various effects, the available capital in the background suddenly dropped. And we saw a lot of third-party capital in particular no longer being available to the same degree. This takes a little bit of a reinsurance lens here, but it has a direct effect on the primary insurance industry, and then of course as a result also on the underlying risks, so homeowners, etc. So if we then take a look at that and say capital is constrained, what do we expect responses to be? So insurers and reinsurers are struggling, and I'm really struggling with the controls here, apologies, but insurers are struggling and looking for innovative alternatives to finding capacity in the market. And I mentioned previously that deploying sidecars after major disasters became a thing. So it has started post Katrina. We do see more structured bespoke deals, particularly out of Bermuda, which has been very active and successful in this, but again, struggling in recent years to find long-term investors to be part of this. We find new partnership models, and it's a coincidence that Swiss Re is named here, really just as a recent market example, at an institution level to find ways to secure and securitize with the financial markets directly to make sure that mechanisms are in place when things really go south. We have agreements with private equity, which is still available. There are some fairly advanced pieces out there. Not all of them are public, but increasingly also the use of technology filters into this adjacent way of capital and risk transfer. And then, of course, we see that the product lines themselves expand. And we see that catastrophe itself actually is no longer just referred to as simply or as naturally in the natural catastrophe sense, but we see increasingly that cyber plays that role. And so the first cyber catastrophe bond transaction came out not long ago to get ahead of that. All of this to say, And then I'm not talking a lot about capital, which sounds far away from the human tragedy of an earthquake, which is why I want to switch a little bit the narrative to what can be done other than capital. And we think that there is actually quite a few avenues that can be explored. Maybe I've managed this time to not jump 2 slides. And we particularly look at this in these 5 pillars. So adapting new technology, finding those public-private collaborations, leveraging analyses and letting that go straight back into the business. Very importantly, that element of customer engagement. Arnaud, you talked about it briefly earlier as well. And then finally, product innovation. And what I would love to do in the next few slides is just to step through each of these pillars and pick up a couple of examples that we've seen from around the world to speak to. So if we start with technology, we find that there is a lot to be harvested in that. And I think there were a lot of wild ideas, but we hope that some of these will become more mature and established. So for example, in the UK, we see flood sensors. So the UK is very flood prone, as you might imagine, but it's particularly in the event of floods, to avoid having the pile-on effect of also having traffic accidents. So using flood sensors to advise drivers of floods and avoid further mishap. The next couple of pieces are around drones, and drones have generally enabled YouTube videos to be extremely powerful, but also in a catastrophe sense, they are being used increasingly to actual direct use. And we see that around the world, and I've picked out a couple of examples here from Japan and South Africa. And I really hope that we will see that kind of technology mature and come to a sort of routine use rather than something which is done ad hoc. If we look at public-private collaboration, I think there is a lot in here, and usually it grows out of a particular situation. So if you look at Flood Re, that goes back to 2000 and the fairly horrific floods in the UK. It then continued on for quite a while as a gentleman's agreement, and was really only formalized, I think, in 2014, and it's still developing. So I want to pick that example up and maybe over-index a little bit on it, because I think there are some parallels which are very useful also here in the sense with Turkey. So Arnaud, you were talking earlier about rebuilding and the value of the damage. And one of the things that Flood reintroduced in 2021, I'm going to say 22, quite recently is my point, is the concept of build back better. So when a house or a property was damaged due to flooding, or is due to damage due to flooding, there isn't just capital to rebuild, which by the way is already more than a lot of properties are insured for, right? Often you can't rebuild your property with the money the insurance company or the pool will pay out. But in the case of Flood Re, the Build Back Better scheme actually says if you build additional flood resilience into it, you will get more money than otherwise would have been due. And I think those are the kind of mechanisms which will ultimately help resilience overall. We see it in Germany as well, where the flow of information and flood awareness was increased dramatically after the floods in Germany a few years ago. In the US, we've already talked a little bit about the various schemes. And then, of course, you have disaster prevention mechanisms, Japan with the early warning systems, but similarly in Thailand and tsunami protection tech in Chile mentioned here. So I think all of these, again, they rely heavily on having a coordinated effort between the private sector and a governmental or public institution. And that really, I think, has proven a very successful avenue to explore. If we look at analyses, we see, again, a couple of pieces picked out here. So we've talked about drones already. Satellite imaging combined with laser scanning has been one of those analytics, or maybe tech. Maybe I could have been put on the previous slide as well. But the the ability to actually look at wildfires at the individual tree level based on this imaging and computing has been a phenomenal step. And then if you think about Hong Kong, in the second example here, the ability to actually map, track, and rate every slope in the country. If you've been to Hong Kong, you'll have seen those little plaques on the wall, which give each slope or gradient on the street a number, which is tracked and traced. I think that's a fantastic system. Again, it relies on two things, right? It relies a little bit on the public-private partnership element, but it is also a mechanism of analyzing the risk that is inherent in people's everyday lives and is the foundation to build some of the other mechanisms like early warning systems on top. Customer engagement is and remains, I think, one of the things where, I don't know, maybe this is just a Swiss thing, but insurers tend not to dare interrupt their customers' lives, but it's actually often quite important. And Balois, and we've really picked them out from a sort of local reference point. This is nothing particularly outrageous, but I remember it happened quite early on already. This probably goes back 15 to 20 years in the context of fire, where a fairly large campaign was launched to get individuals' awareness up on the danger of home fires, and pairing that with, you know, here's a smoke detector, and actually it's a win-win situation for the insurer to hand these out for free, but it also really increased the awareness of the population on that particular peril. Similarly, and this is maybe the most relevant in this context, in the US, Travelers, again, as a company, introduced a very extensive series of earthquake education material, including a little safety quiz to get people aware of how prepared they actually are in the grand scheme of things, as a very simple way of both advertising, but also making it very easy to educate. And then Sompo in Singapore, this is more on the driving side, but again, weather related. What is a safe practice to drive during rain season, during monsoon, when it's really very different environment to what you might be used to normally? All of these just examples, right? I think that there's a myriad more that we could think of, but it really shows that there is quite a lot of ground to be covered everywhere around the world to make sure that customers know of the riskiness they actually operate in every day. And then finally, if we think a little bit about product innovation, there are a number of things that again might even be sort of conceivable parallels to Turkey here. I like the example from Mexico, where Mexico is a very tourism heavy and reliant country. And in order to protect the things which ultimately attract tourists, particularly in coastal areas, tourist income is used directly to purchase parametric insurance to protect some of the reefs in the event of natural catastrophe. This is very tailored and very specific, but again, it speaks to that innovation on the product level, on a partnership level, and also on an economy level to protect the assets of a country. And then finally, in the US, and this is far more sort of the capitalist end of things. Of course, there are a lot of MGAs innovating heavily on products, using new algorithms, using new underwriting approaches to assess property risk in the context of hurricanes here, which again have a chance to serve a market more precisely, and it's certainly been a very successful model for those MGAs. Not sure again what the reinsurance industry will ultimately say to what comes out of these, but we'll leave that for another discussion maybe. So with all of these, and I appreciate this was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, so we've put a little summary in here. I think it's you know, this is an insurance event rather than a consulting or a reinsurance event to that degree. So what can insurers actually do? And I think there are some actions which which you can take away from some of this. And rather than read out all the individual pieces, because I'm sure you'll find what interests you most on the page yourself anyway, I would have pointed particularly again to the customer engagement piece and exploring that customer education piece. And paired with, as Arnaud, you pointed to very successfully in the aftermath of the Turkey earthquake earlier this year, the availability, the sharing, and the using of data to do that. What I want to close on, and I think this is a call to action really for all of us, the NatCat risks are ever rising. And if we as an industry, and I really put all of us into the same boat here, if we as an insurance industry disregard the power of innovation and the ability it creates with us, we will continue to feel the effects of dislocation and market imbalance very, very strongly, and it will continue to hit the industry very hard. With that, I would like to thank you all and hand back.
Çok teşekkürler Arnaud, Kopp ve Raphael, Troitzsch çok güzel ve aydınlatıcı sunumları için. Özellikle çok hızlı bir genel bir toparlama yapmak isterim. Sonra da sizlere sözü vermek isterim. Çok ciddi anlamda bir bilgi sağ olsunlar bombardımanla bizi tuttular. Buradan ciddi anlamda çıkarılacak dersler ve alınacak ödevler var. Belli ki birçoğunda da biz farkında olduğumuz konular ama belki harekete geçme konusunda da bizi bu anlamda tetiklemiş olacaklar. Ben her ikisine de değerli katkıları ve sunumlar için peşinden teşekkür etmek istiyorum. Özellikle Arnaud, Türk sigorta sektörünün iyi bir sınav verdiğini, yani en azından yurt dışından görüntü itibariyle bence çok değerli bir tespitti bu. Biz de kendimizi bu anlamda inanın sektör olarak iyi bir sınav verdiğimiz konusunda açıkçası görüyor idik ama bunun farklı bir gözle değerlenmesi çok değerli ama baktığınız zaman protection gap'e çok ciddi anlamda değindi. Burada gerçekten Türkiye olarak bizim ciddi bir koruma açığıyla yakalandığımız aşikar. Dolayısıyla koruma açıklarını nasıl kapatacağımız konusuna yeni dönemde kafa yormamız şart. Biz de birlik olarak bütün paydaşlarla bu çerçevede bir fokus grup ve işte bir takım toplantılarla hem regülatöre hem de kanun koyuculara ve devlete bu anlamda bir takım mesajları vermek şeyinde hissediyoruz yani sorumluluğunda. Öte yandan Raphael de özellikle hem inovasyonun hem de bu anlamda işte yeni ürünler, özellikle parametrik yapay zekanın kritik rolüne değindi. Verinin işlenmesi ve özellikle hep bizim de söylediğimiz, Türkiye'de de iyi örneklerini gördüğümüz bu katastrofik risklerle mücadelede özel sektör ve devlet işbirliğinin, yani tüm paydaşlarla aslında bu işi ne sektörün kendi başına bu işin altından kalkabilir ne de devletin tek başına. Dolayısıyla buradaki işbirliğinin önemine dikkat çekti. Diyeyim, benim aldığım en kritik notlar bunlardı. Bu çerçevede sizlerden gelecek soruları şimdi biraz zaman ayırmak istiyorum. Lütfen hani sorusu olanlar el kaldırabilirlerse, varsa her iki değerli konuşmacımıza bu fırsatı yakalamışken. O zaman ben bir soruyla şey yapayım, süreci başlatayım. Aslına bakarsanız hani her iki konumuza da ya da keynote'umuza da sorum olacak. Hani bu kadar süreci irdelediniz ve birçok da çözüm önerisi veya gelecekte yapılacak konuya değindiniz ama hani ikinize de sorsam hani birinci ders ne olurdu Türkiye'de sigortacılar anlamında? Bu deprem felaketinden sonra çıkarılması gereken bir numaralı ders nedir sizce? Bu kadar sıraladığınız aksiyon çerçevesinde. Bir de hani bir sonraki katastrof hep konuşuyoruz. Yani mevcutta iyi bir sınav verdik ama yenisine hazırlanma çok kritik ve önemli. Dolayısıyla nereden başlamalıyız? Yani müşteri customer engagement çok önemli. Onları anlatmak ve benzeri ama bu iki çerçevede bizi nasıl aydınlatabilirsiniz? Önce isterseniz Arnaud senden başlayalım. Sonra Raphael'e döneyim. Çok teşekkürler.
Thanks, Özgür, for the questions. So for me, I think and I come here maybe from a reinsurance perspective, and then maybe Raph has some views on the customer engagement side. But
tabii ki bakacağım bu anlamda.
Reminded us about the importance of accumulation control and the fact that we were maybe focused extremely on Istanbul, and we might have forgot that we potentially could have exposure outside Istanbul and creating severe damages and severe amount of casualties. And so I think from this event there are great learnings and actions points in terms of course, as an insurance industry and each insurer having a more granular view about their portfolio composition. And it can be here I'm talking about accumulated scenario, especially earthquake, but you can apply it to other scenario like Raphael mentioned with flood, but for earthquake specific. So gaining a better understanding about, okay, where my portfolio sits and how potentially an event in some spot areas could impact my portfolio. And based on that, the level of protections that I need to have accordingly. So I think on that, we can get to a further level of granularity at the country level. But even if we think about Istanbul, I think from this event, we will get as well some great learnings regarding construction. Of course, there are a lot of discussions around the construction codes, but I think we should focus on, I think what learnings can we get from there for the next event, I think is extremely important, but as well soil composition. And I really like what Raphael was mentioning with the case of Hong Kong and, and thinking about, okay, if we think Istanbul, how could we leverage the learning from this event to Istanbul in terms of the modeling? But model is one thing, as I said, but more about portfolio and portfolio composition and accumulation control. And I think we can get to a further level of understanding of the risk and in leveraging learnings from this event and at the country level, but as well for Istanbul. So we are better ready as an industry.
Thanks, Arnaud. I would add maybe a couple of points to that. And the first one I think is less aimed at the sort of the financial aspect of it, but really more at the human element of it. I think particularly if you think about a highly condensed area like Istanbul, I think as part of that customer engagement, I think you can only gain by alerting people to what happens if it hits. And thinking ahead of what certain responses to that might be. That doesn't necessarily have any impact on the financial implications of an earthquake, but it may have significant impacts on the human and casualty impact of an earthquake or a situation. And it allows, I think, to enter into the conversation around, so do you know what to do? Do you have your bag packed? Do you have emergency rations? Do you know, et cetera, et cetera? And on the back of that, I think a conversation around how safe is your building actually can come far more naturally, and you have a different sort of entry point than if the insurance industry, which is often seen a little bit as a proxy to the police, right? If it's not the right thing, then it's not insured. And I think entering into that kind of dialogue goes a long way towards understanding also from a more infrastructural point of view, as you mentioned, Arnaud, the situation. And I think then the second point I would make is, as we've already seen in the response, documenting that, and I don't mean on paper, but quite the opposite, in centrally accessible databases, which can be used by the whole industry, as well as in the event of an emergency, also public response would be a great thing that can be done now, right? You don't have to wait. That can be tackled right now.
Thank you Raphael. Teşekkürler Raphael. Bir sorumuz var. Arnaud, sana da çok teşekkür ederim atlamadan. Her ikinizin de tespitleri çerçevesinde aslında hakikaten bilinçlendirme çok kritik önemde belli ki. SDDK'dan bir daire başkanımız kendisi el kaldırdı. Buyurun.
Evet. Merhabalar. Ben Raphael Bey'in sunumundaki şeye takıldım biraz da. Buradaki eğer hani innovation olmazsa sigortacıların bu dislocation efekti hissedeceğini söylemişti. Orayı çok anlayamadım. Hani daha açması mümkün müdür acaba?
So thank you for the question. I think the industry will, I think I was probably a little bit imprecise. I think we as a society will feel the impact of dislocation. I think that will have a trickle down effect on the insurance industry as well. But I think particularly where we see large natural catastrophes of any description happen around the world, it usually leads to people literally being displaced from their original habitat, and that is not a situation that I think any of us would wish to be in. And moving as an industry from the financial payout after the event increasingly ahead of that to say we will support you through the entire journey of actually being able to remain where you have your home, where you have your family and your surroundings that you probably don't choose to leave, right? Just because your house fell down. That's then a different situation.
Çok teşekkürler Raphael. Başka, evet, Balkır Bey buyurun, sözü size vereyim. Benim de bir sorum var. Eğer şey olursa buyurun lütfen.
Ben Arnaud'a ve Raphael'e sunumlar için teşekkür ederim. Bir konu var, her ikisinin ortak noktası. Aslında soru Arnaud'a. Raphael'in sunumunda resonans kapasitesinin 2022'nin ilk 9 ayında %17 azaldığı sunuldu. Yine Arnaud'un sunumunda da özellikle Bermuda'da long term yerine yani uzun dönem yerine kısa dönem ve duruma göre ısmarlama metodu dönüldüğünü söyledi. Bu iki bilgiyle hem Türkiye hem de genelde globalde catnet eventlerinin artmasıyla da birlikte resonans kapasitesi, gerileme termsleri, sunumun bütününe baktığın zaman bilinçlendirme ve bazı ülkelerde bir levy, bir vergilendirme ya da ön havuzlarla kete akacak riski azaltma gibi bazı öneriler de vardı. Bu bütünsellik çerçevesinde bu tip eventler artıyor ise bir sebebi resonans kapasitesinin azalması ve maliyetlerin artması mıdır? Aynı zamanda bu yıl ve önümüzdeki yıllarda hem fiyat hem kapasite hem de yönetim açısından büyük perspektif bize çizebilirler mi? Teşekkür ederim.
Çok teşekkürler Balkır. Ben de benzer bir soru soracaktım.
No, thanks a lot for the questions. So I think in terms of and I think it's linked to what Raphael was mentioning with the public-private partnership. So the concept of applying a levy, especially for natural catastrophe, and to ensure a large-scale mutualizations at the level of the country, it's quite popular because you make sure that you have this this insurance coverage for the majority of the people. So if I'm not mistaken, I think the France as well have similar thing, that when you buy, I think, a household insurance, you have as well this levy which is applying, which is covered for the natural catastrophe. So, and I would say it's tackling the main problem, which is it's difficult to sell insurance. Therefore, it's a really efficient way to make sure that the product is distributed and that the principle of mutualization is applied, because the more people are buying it, the more affordable you can do it for the majority. And so I would say it's more about that it's an efficient tool to ensure insurance penetration rather than a link with the reinsurance market dynamic, where we see a decrease, and where, if I could add some elements, is the reinsurance capacity as well. So the reinsurance market has been under a certain amount of stress in terms of financial results, and the shareholders of looked at the industry in a challenging way. And if you were looking at, I think there is a big event in reinsurance conference, which is in Monte Carlo every year. And if you were watching the videos of the CEOs speaking about it, they were all talking about return on equity. So basically, their shareholders challenging them regarding the amount of volatility with the increase of Nat Cat, that they wanted to have more certainty around the level of return. And so, and then of course you need to look at how the financial market is, because reinsurance was as well an alternative to as a class of assets for some institutional investors. So you have multi-dynamic, but I just wanted to have this perspective where when we see the decrease, and I think what would be interesting as well is to look at the graph of Raphael next year with 2023 figures, and to see how the dynamic is coming. So, so in short, I think overall, such tools of levies, it's because it's not easy to sell insurance. And if you want to make sure that everyone is protected and you reduce the protection gap, it's efficient, because you can really apply the mutualization concept at a country level.
And maybe just the one point I would love to add to that, Arnaud, I fully agree with everything. I think the mutualization concept is one of them, but I think in this particular instance, it also allows particularly those with the least means to afford something, they are automatically included. And I think if we go back to the flood re-example in the UK, that was one of the key notions there, that it should not be the case that someone who thinks they can't afford a particular cover gets off the hook and then isn't covered. So it's almost an enforced coverage, which ensures that particularly the most vulnerable have it.
Çok teşekkürler. Thank you for the answers. Let me check if there is another additional question from the floor. Sanırım yok. O zaman bu ilk webinarımızın bu vesileyle kapanışını geçeyim. Ben bu vesileyle tekrar konuşmacılarımıza destekleri için hem Arnaud'a hem Raphael'e değerli sorunlar için çok teşekkürler. Katılım sağladığınız için sizlere. Ve alayın hani de gizli kahramanları var. Özellikle Boston Consultancy Group'tan Lale Hanım'a, o da bizlerle beraber, Elif Hanım'a, yine Türkiye Sigorta Birliği Genel Sekreterimiz Aysun Hanım ve bizim kurumsal iletişim ekibimizden Melike Hanım'a ve değerli tüm destek veren arkadaşlarıma çok teşekkür ediyorum bunu mümkün kıldıkları için. Ben hepinizle tekrar bu ilk iki olan webinarımızın devamında tekrar görüşmek dileğiyle diyeyim. Lale, siz bir şeyler söylemek ister misiniz kapanışta belki? Sanırım. Peki. Çok teşekkürler hepinize. Tekrar sağlıkla kalın. İyi günler diliyorum.
Thank you.